Okay, welcome here to my live. I think this is maybe my second live on YouTube. So I'm learning, um, but I want to do it more regularly. But again, I'm just learning. I'm gonna have to promote it and so forth. But today I want to deal with the subject of sins of the fathers. That phrase I've heard before, but never dived into it deeply. So today I want to dive into that. What does the Bible mean when it says sins of the fathers? Exodus 34:7 says, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the sins of the father upon children and children to the third and fourth generation. So keep that in mind. I'm talking about the sins of the fathers. And Exodus 34, we find that in verse 7, saying, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the sins of the fathers upon children and children's children to the third and fourth generation. What does that mean? Well, that's very important, especially when you come into you're talking about the scripture and world history. So this is where we find the term visiting the sins of the fathers upon children and your children to the third and fourth generation. What happened is also I want to bring to mind that it says that even keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty. So even though God may forgive a person of their sin, that what they have done is going to be passed on to their kids and their children, all the way possibly to the third generation. So let that sink in for a moment. Keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity, and if you want to write this down, this is Exodus 34:7. Forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the sins of the father upon the children. And so I want to tie this into the transatlantic slave trade and other major things in world history that people have overlooked. When our fathers failed God, their sins that they committed is what created what became the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, he said, forgiving mercies to thousands, iniquity and sin, but visiting the sins of the fathers. The sins of the fathers, again, you have people that's on earth now who's suffering for something their forefathers did many, many years ago, decades ago, some hundreds of years ago. You have people that have illnesses that came from their fathers' sin. You had people that's in jail for murder. If you go back in their history, their great granddad was a murderer. So the sins of the fathers visit children and children to the third and fourth generation. So that covers a long period of time. And that's what we have to keep in mind. Appreciate you all that's popping in. It's actually my first live. I want to get more familiar with it. I have been on TikTok a little more, but this is my first live. I just decided to jump on. I got home from work and said I'm gonna just dive right in. So definitely a rookie here, but I wanted to dwell on this subject, the sins of the father, and how that relate to us as the lost tribe of Judah, and us that was brought here to America during the transatlantic slave trade. Because the sins of the fathers go upon generations and generations for their behavior. And so we find that. in Jeremiah 16:10, um, the Bible covers the people that was brought in the transatlantic slave trade. It's been left out of the main narrative of Christianity. It's been left out of the main narrative of many religions and so forth. And yet you have close to 40 million people here in this country, not to mention that scattered around the world, that's still displaced, still living in exile. And the world is act like it's just not even important or it's not a big deal. It is a big deal because all the prophets foretold about the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, the Bible talked about those people that would be taken captives, sold, taken to a foreign land, and served 400 years. Those were the Israelites' penalty that Moses told them in Deuteronomy 28:64. And this was after early Egyptian bondage. He said, if you fail God, you will be taken back to Egypt again. So he's talking about a second event. If you fail, you're going to be taken back to Egypt again. And so most people hear about the 400 years that he told Abraham in Genesis 15:13, that know of a surety that thy seed should be a stranger in the land, not theirs. They should be afflicted and serve 400 years. Most people associate that with early Egyptian bondage. That's totally false teaching. We've been taught that. I know I was taught that as a kid and to adulthood. And now I found out that that does not match the scriptures. Yes, the early Egyptian bondage was not 400 years. They sojourned 430 years, the Bible says, meaning their stay in Egypt was 430 years. They was not in slavery for 430 years. And so we've been taught wrong about that. The 400 years is the transatlantic slave trade. And so to prove that, the prophets spoke of it, the people that would be taken, those that was taken in early Egypt was Israelites. Those that came in the transatlantic slave trade was the descendants of the biblical Israelites. And this is where the confusion have come in at. And so you had the mixed up message that's been propagated for the past few hundred years that the 400 years was the early Egypt. But that's not true, because when they went to Egypt, they went because there was a famine in the land that they were in. And so they went over to Egypt for corn to get some food of some sort. So keep that in mind. So when they went, they reconciled with their brother Joseph. And after they reconciled with their brother Joseph, they were given the best of the land of Egypt. They was provided a personal introduction to Pharaoh. Personal introduction. They were not strangers when they got to Egypt. Their brother Joseph was the boss. And so they have mixed these narratives and really have propagated lies. The 400 years that the Bible talk about was not in early Egypt. It was the 400 years that the descendants of the Israelites were served, which was the transatlantic slave trade. And I know people haven't heard this because they haven't been given the truth. But the Bible proved that there was two forms of Egyptian bondage, the early Egypt and then the second Egypt that Moses talked about in Deuteronomy 28:64, and Jeremiah go echo the same thing in Jeremiah 16:13-14. He talked about the second Egyptian bondage, and America became that second land of bondage. And so this is where the mix-up have come in at. So keep that in mind, the sins of the father. And so in Jeremiah 16:10, and he said, when they begin to ask, why have such evil come upon us? Why have we been treated in such a terrible way? Now, they was talking about this transatlantic slave trade, I have learned. All the prophets foretold about the transatlantic slave trade. And this is why people are in religion and they confused and the pieces are not matching, because they have altered the narrative, not the word. They altered the narrative and they have it all mixed up. So all the prophets spoke of the transatlantic slave trade. And here in Jeremiah, he's explaining why it took place. There's many reasons, but he explained it. He says, so God told him when these people begin to ask why this evil have come upon them. Jeremiah in the verse 11, chapter 16 of Jeremiah, verse 11, because your fathers have forsaken me, said the Lord, and walked after other gods and served them and worshiped them and have forsaken me. Now notice this, Jeremiah is telling them, well, God told Jeremiah to tell the people when they ask, why have this evil, this great evil come upon us? And again, he's talking about the transatlantic slave trade. If you read the rest of Jeremiah 16, he's going to go into talking about the first Egypt bondage and the second Egypt. Now, see, Christianity, they have left out the second Egyptian bondage because what they have tried to do is make the slave trade go away. But all the prophets foretold about what became the transatlantic slave trade. The first time the transatlantic slave trade is mentioned is in Genesis 9:27. Write that down if you haven't seen that. Genesis 9:27 is the first mention of the transatlantic slave trade. Noah said that Japheth would be enlarged and Canaan would become the servant after he become enlarged. So Canaan was going to become a servant to Japheth descendants, which are the Gentile Europeans. That's in Genesis 9:27. That's the first mention of what will become the transatlantic slave trade. And so here Jeremiah is talking about why this was going to happen, because your fathers have forsaken me, said the Lord, and walked after other gods and served them, worshiped them, and have forsaken me. Then he go on in that same chapter. He said, the time going to come where you no longer will say the Lord liveth that brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, but the Lord liveth. Now see, he's talking about the second one. But the Lord liveth that brought the children of Israel from the land of the north. Yes, so he bring up the two, comparing the two. Moses also spoke of the two in Deuteronomy 28:64, where he said, if you fail, you're going to be taken to Egypt again. That word again, clarifying there was going to be a second event like the first one. Now, see, the enemy have made people think it's one event. No, it's two events. What they have tried to do is cover the transatlantic slave trade and how significant it is in biblical history and the people that was brought in the slave trade. The Bible talk about these Israelites that's going to be scattered around the world, and yet they have left the people out that the Bible is talking about. Yes, the ones that was going to be scattered, Moses says that in Deuteronomy 28:64. He said, if you fail God, you're going to be taken to Egypt again by ships. Now, keep that in mind. He's telling you how they're going to be scattered. You're going to be taken to Egypt again by ships. They're going to put a yoke of iron on your neck. And you look at the old pictures of the slave trade, you see those yokes of iron, just as Moses said. And he said that they were going to sell your sons and daughters, and no one will buy you back. Now, see, most people never knew that because they never heard this. This is what the truth is. And I ask you to seek God about it and see if what I'm telling you is 100% accurate. Yes. And this is why I'm going to start coming on here more, because I've been on TikTok quite a bit, and people are coming to the truth. The tribe of Judah is waking up. The lost sheep is waking up. And so I'm going to start coming here on YouTube as well, because a lot of people have never heard what the Bible really teaches. They have been taught a doctrine that does not match scriptures. And I want you to check and scrutinize what I'm saying to see if it's absolutely 100% accurate. I didn't receive this message from man. I didn't receive this from online. I was taught this divinely, and I attest that it is 100% accurate, and I want you to scrutinize it. And so, yes, the Bible talk about two bouts of slavery. Early Egyptian, that was not 400 years because they went there, and the Bible let us know that they lived and prospered greatly in the land of Goshen when they went to Egypt. So, and they began to multiply and they prospered greatly. And so they did that for a couple of hundred years out of the 430 they were there. So they did not serve 400 years because the first 200 or more years, they prospered greatly, so much that the Egyptians said, wait a minute, these people are outshining us. They becoming great among us. And so they decided to do something about it. So keep that in mind. And so they spent the last maybe close to 200 years in slavery, but not 400. But when we came, we was brought in as slaves on day one. Slaves on day one. We didn't have a 200-year cushion as our ancestors did when they came into early Egypt. And so when Abraham was told in Genesis 15:13, know of a surety that thy seed should be a stranger in a land not theirs. A stranger in the land not theirs. When we came here, we were strangers, and it was a land not ours. And he said, and they shall be afflicted 400 years. That 400 years is very important because that's the 400 years we have just served. We served the 400 years. There's nobody else on the planet going to match those receipts. We are those people that the Bible talk about. And so they have taught a narrative that have left out the main people, have left out hundreds of scriptures. Now you write this down and look that up. Deuteronomy 28:64-68. That's nowhere in the narrative of religion, even Christianity. It's not going to fit nothing. It's not going to fit their narrative. And so you're clear on that. I believe the whole word of God. I reject their narrative. They took part of the word and connected it to a different Christ, a Gentile Christ. And they left out the people the Bible was talking about. Jesus was not a Gentile. And so they have created a narrative that's disaligned, misaligned, and misinformed when it comes to biblical scripture. And so we have drank this propaganda for our ancestors for a few hundred years. It does not match. So early Egyptians' bondage was our ancestors. But Moses said, if you fail, you're going to go in bondage again. So they did fail. Find in history where you're going to find where another group of people went into bondage for 400 years after Moses had told the Israelites that. And so Jeremiah is here telling us about the sins of the father, because your fathers have forsaken me, your descendants was going to go back into bondage. So keep that in mind. And he told us what our fathers did. What did they do? He said they forsook me. They walked after other gods, and they served them and worshiped them, and they have forsaken me. And this is what created what came later and became known as the Transatlantic Slave Trade. These is the sins of the fathers. And so what did he say? The sins of the father is going to visit your children to the third and fourth generation. So that covers a lot of generations. So our fathers failed God, and that's what led to the transatlantic slave trade. And how did we become Abraham's seed? Because he said, no, surely your seed. Well, Abraham's seed, the Israelites, dwelt in the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan was a land that was full of Africans. They were the youngest son of Ham. And so the Israelites began to intermarry with the African Canaanites that they were supposed to push out of the land, but they never did. And so you had the Israelites connected with the Canaanites, and they made up the biblical Israelites. Yes, maybe you never heard that. So yes, Abraham's great-grandsons, they began to marry with Africans. And if you need the receipts for that, look in Judges 3, 5, and 6. Yes, that's one of the biggest mysteries there. Judges 3, 5, and 6 says that the Israelites took the Canaanite women to be their wives, and they gave their daughters to be wives to the Canaanites. And that's what connected us to the biblical Israelites. Yes, the biblical Israelites lived in Canaan. That was a land of Africa that later became the land called Israel. That's still a part of Africa today. They just have covered it up and call it the Levant. They call it the Middle East. That is still Northeast Africa. It was named Canaan before it was called Israel, and Canaan was the youngest son of Ham. Yes, so the Israelites was born in Canaan. They was born in Africa. Did you know that? because Abraham left his people behind and God showed him the land of Canaan and he promised him one day he was going to own that land. Well, who was there before Abraham arrived? The African Canaanites. Who are the African Canaanites? The African Canaanites, according to Genesis 9, 27, were people that was going to be identified as servants of servants, and they was going to eventually go into slavery to Japhet descendants. That's what identify us as descendants of the biblical Canaanites. Yes, the biblical Canaanites became the African Americans, so-called, that was taken in the slave trade. But those same Canaanites intermarried with the Israelites. And this is why God changed him from Abram to Abraham, foreseeing that Abram descendants was going to connect with the Hamites, those that came through Ham. This is why he changed him from Abram to Abraham, because he told Abraham, remember, to leave his kinfolks behind. So his seed was not going to come through his actually kin. And this is the mystery that's been hidden for ages. Yes, this is the mystery that's been hidden for ages. He called Abram that you will become of a great nation. So he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. Yes, because he was going to dwell in the land of Ham's children, which was the Canaanites, and they began to intermarry. That's how we became descendants of the biblical Israelites. And so when he told Abram later, and a great sleep fell on him, he said, know of a surety, the time going to come that your descendants is going to be taken to a foreign land. They're going to be afflicted and they're going to serve 400 years. Now, see, this is what it means by the sins of the fathers in Exodus 34:7. He said, yes, visiting the sins of the father upon the children and children to the third and fourth generation, meaning a lot of the sins that took place with our ancestors, it went generations and generations later, which is why we ended up in the transatlantic slave trade, because of the sins of the father. Because when it took place, we wasn't ready, and that's why they were able to take us. Had we been ready, the tribe of Judah, and if you want to see receipts for that, go to Genesis 38. Judah had kids with guess who? African Canaanites. Yes, many of the Israelites had kids with Canaanites. Why? Because that's the land they dwelled in. They didn't go back to their kinfolks that was in the land that Abraham left, Mesopotamia. They lived and were born in the land of Canaan, which was the land of Africa. It was the land that we now know to be Jerusalem. That was the indigenous people were Canaanites, Africans. The land of Bethlehem, Africans. Jordan, African. Israel, Africans. So this is what have been hidden. These people were natives. Abraham's seed and his kids and grandkids grew up and immersed in the culture of Africa. And so they were all Semitic speaking people. The Shamites and the Hamites, they dwelled together. And so when Abraham came among them, his language was Hebrew. That was one of the Semitic languages. And so they was able to coexist because they spoke similar languages and they were dark-skinned and they came among dark-skinned Africans. They all were dark-skinned people. You say, well, how do you know that? Because Moses, who came through Shem, passed for the Egyptian. He looked just like, they all looked similar because they had been intermingling for hundreds of years by the time Egyptian bondage came along. Keep in mind, they had lived there. Abraham was there 10 years at one point before his kids began to flourish in that land of Canaan. And so by the time they went to Egyptian and went into bondage, and by the time they went into bondage, hundreds of years had passed. Who did they have kids with? They kept having kids with Africans. And keep in mind, Abraham had 8 sons, 7 of them were with African women. Now, you see how things have got twisted up. Hollywood have covered up things and created an alternative narrative that don't match truth. Abraham had 8 kids, 7 of them were with African women. So when you think of the Israelites, you have to think of the African Canaanites. When you think of the Israelites, and if you need receipts, write this down, Judges 3, 5, and 6. You can't overstep that. And this is what have been left out. Hundreds of scriptures I've been shown have been left out of the popular narrative that we've been taught. We've been taught a false version of truth. Yes, false version of truth. Judges 3, 5, and 6 is mind-blowing because it let us know that the Israelites began to intermarry with the Canaanites. Yes, the Israelites began to marry with the people that was going to become cursed, that was going to become servants to Japheth descendants. So you got the blessed promised seed joining forces and intermingling and marrying with the people that will become a curse. So when you do that, what happened is you have a dual heritage. We have a heritage as the children of Abraham, and we have a heritage as those that was cursed. So this is why we begin to look at history, and it all become clear. It all become very clear. Yes, Judah had kids with African Canaanites. And that's where we came through the tribe of Judah. They were dark-skinned people with woolly hair. And Jesus was too. He came through the tribe of Judah. And this is why they have tried to cover it up. Jesus was a dark-skinned person with woolly hair. And I dare say he had locks because many of the prophets back then had locks. Did you know that? Ezekiel, the Bible tells us that the angel lifted Ezekiel by the locks of his hair. We know the story about Samson. We just overlooked it, that he had his locks cut. Those were black people. We have been deceived by this popular narrative of religion. I reject them all and accept the whole word. I accept the Bible 100%. I reject their narratives of what they have taken parts of the word and mixed it with a Christ and said, this is him. Jesus is real. Their image is wrong. They have a Gentile saying he is a Jew. That's not how that match. That's not how that work. The Israelites were dark-skinned people, and they dwelt in Africa among dark-skinned people. And they began to intermarry into the place where you couldn't separate them. You could not separate them because remember, Noah had 3 sons, and there's 2 categories, Jews and Gentiles, but there's 3 sons. How that work? That means 2 of the sons will have to fit in one of the categories. Ham and Shem descendants fed in one category. Japheth descendants stayed in a category by themselves. Now I'm going to say that again. There's 2 categories, Jews and Gentiles, but there's 3 brothers, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, that all people of the earth descended from, the Bible teaches, right? So if there's 2 categories, but 3 brothers, 2 gonna have to dwell in one of the categories. Yes, Japheth descended dwelled in one category by itself, and the other 2 brothers dwelt in the category together. Shem and Ham descended. You can't separate the Shemites from the Hamites. Why? Because Judges 3, 5, and 6 says that they intermarry. For hundreds of years, the Israelites intermarried with Africans. And they only was in 2 lands, Canaan and then Egypt. Both of the lands were African. If you can find that they dwelt anywhere else, please show me. The Israelites dwelt in 2 lands, Canaan, which was among Africans, and then they spent the 430 years in Egypt among Africans. There was never a time that the Israelites didn't dwell among Africans. They lived in the land, they was born in the land of Canaan. And in the land of Canaan, that's very peculiar that the land of Canaan housed Judea. Those they was indigenous people were African Canaanites. You had Bethlehem, you had Nazareth. Now you get in the picture. You had Capernaum, you had Galilee, you had Jerusalem. All of those were lands of Africans. Now you get in the picture. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That was in the land of Canaan. Who were the indigenous people? The indigenous people were African Canaanites. That was the youngest son of Ham. And so why did God pick Canaan? Remember, he cursed Ham, but it fell upon his youngest son, who was Canaan. This is where the sins of the fathers come in at. Why did he pick Because Ham had 4 sons. Why did he pick Canaan? Canaan was the youngest of the 4 sons. So the sins of Ham rested on the children, just like we see in Exodus, visiting the sins of the father upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And so that's people now that's on the earth that's affected in their ways due to the sins of their fathers, maybe hundreds of years ago. Did you know that? Yes. And so we have people now saying, well, we're not responsible for what our fathers did. Yeah, you are. They say, well, we don't have to pay no reparations. We didn't do it, but your fathers did. We didn't do anything to deserve what we have now, but our forefathers did. So yes, you're going to have to pay for the sins of your father. So the stuff that happened to God's people during the transatlantic slave trade, all those lynchings, all the hangings, all the dehumanization, the next generation of those that's on the earth, they're going to pay for that. And they need to be aware of that. The sins of the father is visiting the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. So those that enslaved our people are going to have to pay that. So far, it seems like they have got away with immunity. That's not how the Bible works. Because Exodus 34:7, he said, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty. He'll forgive a person, but that sin that was created is going to fall on your children's children. Unless they get saved, that's the only way. If they get saved, it breaks that. And then it goes on to the next generation. If they get saved, it keep going on and so forth. But so that sin that your forefathers have committed is going to fall on the kids. So those that enslaved us, their kids have yet to pay the penalty for that, but it's coming. You say, well, how do you know? Because that's what the book of Revelation talk about. Yes, it's all there in the book of Revelation when he began to send judgment down. That's not going to be no immunity for that. And this is what they haven't been taught. In the way they have treated God's people, there's going to be recompense. In fact, Jesus' 3rd appearance is coming for one reason, and that is as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he's coming to pay recompense for what have happened to his people that have been scattered. We still living in exile. Did you know that? We still scattered. We still in the land of captivity. And so this is what we're going to have to begin to reckon with and realize. But the sins of the fathers rest on the children. And so the sins of our fathers is what put us into the transatlantic slave trade. In Matthew 23:29, it says that they built tombs of the prophets and decorated. And they said to Jesus, but if we were here like our fathers, we would not have killed the prophets. And Jesus said, yes, you know that you are children of those that killed the prophets. So he ran into a group of people that was worshiping the temples and the tombs of the prophets. And they said, if we were here, we would not have killed the prophets like our father. He said, well, you have owned that you are the descendants of those that killed the prophets. And so he said, fill up then the measures of your fathers. That's in Matthew 23:29, that term, fill up then the measures of your fathers. So he's saying you're going to pay for the sins of your fathers, is what he was telling them, because they was saying that our fathers killed the prophet, but if we was here, we would not kill the prophets like our fathers did. He said, yes, you have acknowledged the fact that your fathers are the ones who killed the prophets. And he said, fill up then the measures of your fathers. What that meant is you're going to have to pay their debt. You have to pay their debt. And that's just the way it worked. We went into the transatlantic slave trade, not because of what we did, but because of what our forefathers did. Keep that in mind. Not because of what we did, but because of what our forefathers did. What did they do? Jeremiah told us. He said it's in Jeremiah 16:10, because your fathers have forsaken me, said the Lord, and walked after other gods, served them, worshiped them, and forsaken me. He gave 5 reasons, and there's many other reasons, but he gave 5 on what led to the transatlantic slave trade. You say, well, how do you say the Bible mentioned the transatlantic slave trade? All the prophets spoke of the transatlantic slave trade. It's just been left out of their narrative. Jesus in Luke 21, write that down. He's talking about the transatlantic slave trade that Moses talked about, that Abraham got witness to, that Jeremiah talked about, Daniel talked about it, Ezekiel saw it with the dry bones, Joel talked about it. All the prophets spoke of what would become the transatlantic slave trade. And it's been totally left out of the popular narrative. Jesus in Luke 21:24, he says this. He said, they shall fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captives into all nations. They shall be fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captives. Somebody's going to put hands on his people and take them as prisoners and bring them to another land throughout the earth. Now, find anybody on the planet that's going to match that. Find anybody on the planet. I challenge you. Get your scholars, get your reverends, your pastor. Find anybody on the planet that's going to match that one verse. Or the verse that Moses said that if you fail God, you will be taken back to Egypt again. And you're going to have yokes of iron on your neck. And you're going to be taken by ships. Come on now. And you're going to be sold as slaves. And no one will buy you. Somebody sent me a question. Statement. Well, it said nobody gonna buy you, and we were sold, so that can't be the truth. I said, well, it's because you don't know the scriptures and what he meant by buy you. Yes, he said they would be sold, but then he said no one will buy you. How does that make sense? Well, under the law, if a person went into slavery, fell into slavery, a nearest of kin who had the ability and the will could pay for their freedom. He's saying you're going to go into slavery and no one is going to pay for your freedom. You're going to serve that whole time. You're not going to get no good days off or half time. You're going to serve the whole 400 years. And so we had to serve the whole 400. And so this is what he was saying when he said, and no one will buy you, because that means nobody was going to pay the price for our redemption. And you say, well, why not? Because Christ came as the Redeemer and we rejected him. And so when we rejected Christ, that opened the door for what became the transatlantic slave trade. Because yes, we was destined to go into bondage, because Noah mentioned it in Genesis 9:27. So when Jesus came, he came to save us from that, and we rejected him and turned him over to the Gentiles to be killed. And so we killed our Redeemer. And so now it matches what Moses said, that you're going to go into bondage. You're going to get yokes of iron on your neck. You look at any other pictures of the transatlantic slave trade, you're going to see those yokes of iron, just as Moses said. Just as he said, identical. And he said, you're going to be taken by ships and you're going to be sold to your enemies. Now, how are you going to unexplain that? They just left it out. They just left it out because history is going to take you to the transatlantic slave trade. Then you have Jeremiah, and Jeremiah 16:13 and 14. He's talking about the two events. There was two Egyptian bondages, and that was one Exodus, and that's going to be a future Exodus of the same people. They're the same people, but two different eras. The early Egyptian bondage and the modern day Egyptian bondage. You say, well, where's the modern day Egyptian bondage? The Americas are the new Egypt. You say, well, how? Well, because in Jeremiah 16, he said that the time going to come where you no longer will say the Lord liveth that brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, but the Lord liveth that brought the children of Israel, the same people, out of the land of the north. He called the second Egypt the land of the north. Well, you say, but this is the West. Yes, the Gentiles call it the West, but if you're standing on the west coast of Africa, the ships went north. So Jeremiah referred to it as the land of the north. That's where the Israelites are going to be found. We are those people. We come from the tribe of Judah. And Judah, they got exiled from the land of Israel, and they ended up creating a second kingdom outside the west coast of Africa, right there by Benin. And if you look at history, you're going to see that there was another kingdom of Judah there. They were different than the other 11 brothers. Benjamin stayed there with them, but the other brothers were different than Judah. Judah was the strongest of the 12 tribes, and Judah ended up They were kingdom builders, and it was Judah and mixed with the Canaanites. Did you know the Canaanites wrote the first written alphabet? The Canaanites. They are the same people, the African Americans are descendants of the biblical Canaanites. And those same people that wrote the first written alphabet, see how it connects. Thousands of years later, they come up with a whole genre of music or rap, and we wasn't even allowed to read for hundreds of years. You see how that connect? As much as people try to separate, we're connected to the same blood of our ancestors. If you study the early Israelites and you study the African Americans, you're going to see identical, the same arrogance, the same pride, the same stubbornness that they had. Is the same spirit we have. Those are our ancestors. Did you know that? And yes, I know this is new to you and it may take you time, but I want you to check and see if what I'm telling you, if it's true. This is accurate 100%. I didn't receive this from man. And so I want you to scrutinize what I'm saying. And you're going to find there that it is accurate. And I have no ego about it because I didn't know it until God began to teach me. And I'm on here to wake up the tribe of Judah. And so it's time for us to wake up. So the sins of the father, we went into bondage because of the sins of the father. And so we are still in exile in a strange land of captivity. And let them tell it the world is going to end and we just going to end like this. No, the Bible tells us exactly what was going to become of the people that failed God. They was going to be taken captives. They were going to be sold, taken to a foreign land and served 400 years. And one day God was going to bring them back to their land. We still in exile. The restoration to Israel is going to come in the future. Did you know that? Yes, the world been taught that it already happened, but no, where's the 400 years? When were they taken captive? When were they sold? So that was a false teaching. That is not accurate according to scripture. The ones that was taken in the transatlantic slave trade is the people that were scattered throughout the earth. That the Bible said that they was going to be taken captives, they was going to be sold, they was going to be taken to a foreign land, and they was going to serve 400 years. All four of those are very distinct and powerful in themselves. We have all the receipts to that. We was taken captives, we were sold, we was taken to a foreign land, and we served the 400 years. There's nobody else on the planet going to match those four receipts. And God have showed me hundreds of receipts, and we match every one of them. There's no doubt. That's not a speck of doubt. I know who we are. We are the descendants of the biblical Israelites. We are the descendants of the biblical Israelites. Yes, because the receipts that we have that nobody else on the planet have, that separate us from all other people on the planet. That transatlantic slave trade is a central part of the biblical narrative, and it's been washed over like it never happened. Well, God wants people to know what happened, and he wants you to know why. Remember, he wanted his chosen people to be high and lifted above all, that they could see God working and blessing them and so forth. And he said, I set before you blessings and curses. If you do well, you're going to be blessed above all people. But if you fail, you're going to be cursed among all. We are those people. If anybody have an argument with that, then you just need some help. The transatlantic slave trade is the greatest atrocity in human history. I'm going to say that again. The transatlantic slave trade is the greatest atrocity in human history. It's the time on earth that God completely turned his back on his chosen people. And the Bible tells us, he said, I will turn my back on you. And that's what he did. And so this is the greatest atrocity in human history. And when Jesus was on the cross and he said, my God, why have thou forsaken me? He was crying the scream of our ancestors that was in the 400 years of bondage that was screaming because we had been forsaken. God said, I will forsake you. I will mock you when you begin to cry because of what you have done to his name. He wanted us to be lifted high above the earth. And we still have that influence. Even though we have went into bondage, we still set the tone for the earth. There's still something special because we are the apple of God's eye. Those people that came in the transatlantic slave trade became less than humans. They became the lowest of all those on earth. And if you look in Genesis 9, you will see it matches absolutely 100%. Noah said, you're going to be servants of servants. You're going to be servant to your brethren. You're going to be servant to Shem, and you're going to be servant to Japheth, which are the European Gentiles. We are those people that became servant to our own brethren. They're the ones sold us out. We became servants to Shem and Arab slave trade, and we became a servant to Japheth descendants, just as Moses said, Noah said. That's the first mention of the transatlantic slave trade in Genesis 9:27. Mark that down. All of this stuff is factual, and I want you to check the receipts. We are those people. And so all of this connect, that all the prophets spoke of it, and then Jesus confirmed it in Luke 21:24. They should fall by the edge of the sword and should be led away as captives. That is very powerful. I read that before I understood it. Now I understand it. They should be led away captives. They're going to fall by the edge of the sword. We wasn't ready when they came. We was not expecting that, but it was all according to God's divine plan, because we had got exiled from the land, the promised land, and some of us begin to float in different areas of the world, but Judah ended up on the West Coast right there, waiting for the picking. And so at the point of time when the Europeans came over, that was our brothers that sold us out, because they wouldn't have understood our language. We spoke Semitic language. The Gentiles did not speak Semitic languages. They didn't understand us. We didn't understand them. And so our brethren is the ones who caught us and told us and sold us to Japheth descendants, which are the Europeans. Did you know that? And so we was already right there. If you look at a map of the 1700s, you're going to see right there outside of Ghana, Judah. We built the kingdom that was in Judea, and then we built the second Judah right there outside the West Coast. So at the point in time, they said, get them. Why? They despised us. They was our brethren, but you remember, like Joseph, a type of Joseph. Remember, Joseph's brothers despised his favor with God, his coat of many colors. They despised his vision, and they sold him into Egyptian bondage. Remember in the Old Testament, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. And so this is what happened with us. We were favored then. Judah was favored among all the other brothers. Yes, Jacob, when he was getting ready to die, he blessed Judah over the other brothers. So they had an envy against Judah. And that's still envy. We have that today. Even people that came through slavery was the lowest on earth. People still despise us. They despised us then. So when the slave trade was getting ready to take place, they said, get them. And they began to snatch us and sell us and bring us into bondage, just as God had foretold. Just as he told Abraham thousands of years prior. Know of a surety, your seed will be a stranger in a land not theirs. So we was being taken from our homeland, the continent, and brought to a different land. They will be a stranger in a land not theirs. They're going to be afflicted, and they're going to serve 400 years. We are those people. Nobody else on the planet going to come close. I challenge you. Find any people on the planet that was taken captives, taken to a foreign land, sold, and spent 400 years in bondage. Find anyone that matches any one of those, let alone 4. And then there's hundreds of other receipts. This is the place that we need to be. Invite your parents, your children, because this is what's been hidden from us. This knowledge is what's been hidden from us in religion. But it's in the Bible. They just have left it out of their narrative. And so it's there. So the sins of the father is what it comes down to. And we pay the debt. And those that enslaved us, their children is going to pay the debt. And they need to understand that. Their children is going to pay the debt. And you find it played out in the book of Revelation. The time going to come where Jesus is going to actually come and deal with the Gentile nations for what they have done. And the last verse I'm going to use is Matthew 27:25. When Jesus was being crucified, the Jews of that day answered all the people saying, let his blood be upon us and on our children. Let his blood be upon us, is what our forefathers cried. And this is what led to the transatlantic slave trade. They said, let his blood be upon us. And so we was charged for the blood of Christ, even though the Romans, Gentiles, killed him. Jesus, let it be known, he that brought me to you have the greater sin. So we turned our Messiah over to Christ. Turned our Messiah over to the Gentiles who murdered him, which was the Romans. But he said, he that turned me over to them have the greater sin. So our ancestors said, let his blood be upon us and on our children. Now you see how the sins of the father come up on the children. And this is what happened in the transatlantic slave trade. And they would have never imagined that one day we would be free. They would have never imagined, as they walked around with chains on their neck and working from sun up to sundown, forsaken by the God of heaven, the God of the Hebrews. They would have never imagined one day we would be free. But God said one day you're going to be free. And not only that, one day I'm going to return you back to the land of your forefathers. Not because of you, he said, but because I promised. He have kept that promise. The slave owners didn't wake up one day and say, I'm tired of being rich. I'm going to let them go. I am tired of being filthy rich. No, God visited us and brought us out by a mighty hand. The same way he did, he sent Moses in the early testament, Old Testament, to bring them out. But before he did that, God said he went down to hear their groanings. He went to check on them himself. And then he sent Moses in there to tell Pharaoh to bring my people out. And so God have come down to deliver us. Man didn't deliver us. The slave owners didn't decide they was just getting too wealthy and they needed to stop this. They didn't get a heart all of a sudden. No, it was the hand of God to bring us out. And so you do 1619 to 2019, the 400 years have been served. The 400 years has been served. And when the George Floyd event took place, the world was shaken up and people didn't understand what is going on. What in the world is going on? God had come down. It was organic all throughout the earth, signifying the 400 years had been served. And now we have to get free from our mind. Our body is free. The mind have to be freed. Remember the Israelites, even though they left Egypt, they kept murmuring, they kept complaining, they kept saying, well, everything came wrong. We go back to Egypt. They were still thinking like slaves, even though God had brought them out by a mighty hand. And we should be the most excited people on the planet. God has brought us out by a mighty, mighty hand. This was not the hand of man. It was the hand of Almighty God that brought us out. And our ancestors, as they walked around with chains on their neck, they would have never imagined their little children will one day be free. That one day they'll be turned back to the land of their forefathers. And that have yet to happen, but it will. We're going to return back to that promised land. And see, we've been taught lies. But when you put it up to truth, it does not match. Because the Israelites of the Bible were going to be taken captive. They were going to be sold. They were going to be taken to a foreign land. And they was going to be those that served 400 years. And after that, the Lord was going to take them back to the land of their forefathers. And this is what the Bible teaches. So God bless you all. I hope this helped you some. Do continue to come and do be blessed. And I pray that the Lord bless you and continue to draw and help you to understand his word. So God bless you. God bless you. And do make sure you subscribe to the channel and do come back again and do be blessed. So God bless you. I had to get out of here. So see ya. If you have any questions, feel free to send the questions. I would love to answer your questions because I want you to know and I want you to understand. So feel free to send your questions if you have them, because I want you to understand this and I want you to scrutinize it and I want you to check it to see if it's absolutely accurate. Not what you've been taught, but what the Bible teaches. Not what we've been taught, but what the Bible actually teaches. So God bless you all and see you next time.